They refused to serve the black family at the restaurant until the owner found out who they really were. The night air carried a quiet hum of a city settling into its routines. Streetlights cast long shadows over the sidewalks, and the occasional honk of a car reminded passers-by that life moved steadily, even for those who felt invisible. On a well-lit street in the heart of the city stood a restaurant, whose reputation gleamed almost as brightly as its polished windows. Its patrons were usually the wealthy and influential, the kind who expected perfection and whispered about the world with a mixture of entitlement and condescension. That evening, the restaurant's doors opened to reveal a family that, by all appearances to the casual observer, seemed ordinary. A black family, a mother, father, and 2 children, approached with polite smiles and an air of quiet dignity. They were dressed simply but neatly, the father's jacket modest yet well kept, the mother's bag slung gracefully over her shoulder. Their presence should have been unremarkable, almost invisible in a bustling city. Yet the moment they stepped toward the host station, the atmosphere subtly shifted. The host, a young man accustomed to processing the faces and names of the city's elite, looked up, scanning the family with a flicker of judgment in his eyes. His smile did not reach his expression. He hesitated, glanced toward the back, and then shook his head, murmuring words that the family could not fully hear but whose meaning was unmistakable. They could not be seated. Shock and confusion washed over the parents. Their children, sensing tension, looked to their mother and father for guidance, trusting their reaction to frame the reality of the moment. The family had expected polite rejection at worst, perhaps a full house or delayed seating, but the outright denial carried a sting deeper than they anticipated. They had walked many streets in the city, dined in various establishments, yet never had a restaurant made them feel so acutely out of place. Outside, the night seemed unusually still. The family lingered for a moment on the sidewalk, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Their pride and composure remained intact, but beneath it, a simmering anger and disappointment brewed. The father's jaw tightened as he observed the gleaming entrance of the restaurant and the well-dressed patrons who strolled past without noticing the scene. The mother's eyes softened toward her children, silently communicating resilience and patience, a quiet teaching in the face of indignity. Back inside, the owner of the restaurant moved with an elegance cultivated over decades, unaware of the incident unfolding at the host station. She prided herself on discretion and reputation, her attention divided between the front-of-house operations and her carefully maintained image in the city's social circles. The staff around her worked efficiently, their movements rehearsed, their faces often masks of politeness that concealed their personal judgments. But sometimes even the best systems falter, and sometimes the weight of arrogance blinds those who serve the public. The refusal to seat the family had not been ordered from above. It had been a spontaneous, careless judgment from someone assuming authority, someone who thought they knew better than the owner herself. Outside, the family's departure was quiet but deliberate. They did not shout. They did not create a scene. Their dignity served as a shield, their movements measured and composed. Yet the subtle energy they exuded carried an undercurrent of curiosity and suspicion. They did not walk away in ignorance. They would return, and when they did, the world would see that assumptions and prejudice could not erase identity, influence, or history. The moment lingered in the air like a charged pause, a prelude to a storm that no one inside the restaurant yet anticipated. The children's hands brushed each other's subtly, and the mother's eyes traced the reflection of the restaurant's polished windows. Something about that reflection, something intangible, yet perceptible, suggested that the night's injustice would ripple far beyond the sidewalk where it began. The staff inside continued their routines, oblivious to the undercurrent of change that had quietly entered their space. The host, busy with incoming reservations, glanced at the street one last time before resuming his duties. He did not see the subtle, assured steps of the father as he walked down the block, nor the glint of determination in the mother's eyes. They were gone from the scene, but not from the narrative of the evening. For the owner, it was just another night. For the patrons, it was just another dinner. But for the family, this was a moment that would catalyze, events far greater than anyone could predict, a chain of discoveries, connections, and revelations that would challenge assumptions, disrupt comfort, and ultimately expose truths that had long been ignored. And as the city lights reflected off the rain-damp pavement later that night, a figure in the distance, unseen, unrecognized, watched the family's departure, eyes sharp, calculating, observing every nuance, as if aware that the night's events were only the beginning of a story that would leave everyone in the restaurant astonished once the truth came to light. The family may have left the restaurant, but someone had taken notice. Someone who understood who they really were, and the revelation would shake the restaurant's world to its core. The night stretched on, but the memory of the refusal lingered in the minds of the family. They returned home, a modest but comfortable apartment in the heart of the city, where the hum of traffic and distant sirens formed a familiar soundtrack to their lives. Yet that night silence seemed heavier, more reflective. The father sat at the edge of the couch, running his fingers over the armrest, replaying the moment when the host had denied them entry. The indignity stung, not just for himself, but for the children, who had looked to him and their mother for reassurance. The mother moved quietly around the apartment, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. She checked the children's rooms, ensuring they were calm, then sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. Her mind was a flurry of emotions, anger, disappointment, and determination. She understood the layers of society, the unspoken hierarchies, and the assumptions that underpinned them. She also understood patience, and the knowledge that the truth, if revealed correctly, could overturn perceptions in ways sudden confrontation never could. The children, sensing tension but trusting their parents' guidance, whispered quietly among themselves. They had learned early that the world was not always fair, that appearances and skin color often dictated how strangers responded. Yet they also learned resilience, pride, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing their family's worth, unmeasured by superficial judgments. Meanwhile, in a well-appointed office several blocks away, the restaurant owner reviewed the night's receipts and reservation logs. She prided herself on her establishment's image, upscale, exclusive, refined. Complaints were rare, almost non-existent, and her patrons rarely left without satisfaction. The refusal that had occurred at the host station had not reached her immediately. She trusted her staff, confident that they upheld the standards she had, set over years of careful management. But tonight would be different. Somewhere in the city, someone had noticed the family, their calm, composed departure, the dignity with which they carried themselves despite being denied. This observer was not casual. Their recognition was immediate, precise, and significant. And unlike the restaurant staff, this person understood the family's identity, their influence, and the reach they commanded quietly, without ostentation. The following morning, the family resumed their routine, but an undercurrent of tension remained. The father received a subtle message on his phone, one that carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Someone had noticed the injustice. The details were not explicit, yet the tone conveyed that the refusal would not go unanswered, and that the restaurant's assumptions were about to collide with a reality far beyond their comprehension. Back at the restaurant, the owner entered her space with her usual air of authority, unaware that the evening's event had planted seeds of disruption. Her staff moved efficiently, but a subtle unease permeated the air. The host, who had made the decision to refuse the family, felt a flicker of anxiety he could not explain. Something, he sensed instinctively, was about to challenge the carefully constructed hierarchy of their establishment. Then, without warning, the door chimed. A figure entered, not immediately recognizable, yet commanding attention in ways that words could scarcely capture. The family, returned under circumstances of quiet authority, approached once more. But this time their presence carried weight. The air seemed to shift, the staff paused mid-step, and the owner's gaze lifted from her notes, her attention drawn to the family she had dismissed the night before. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken tension. The children held their parents' hands, unaware of the full significance of the moment, yet trusting the quiet confidence radiating from them. The father's eyes met the owner's briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the power dynamic had changed. This was no longer about polite dining etiquette or arbitrary rules of entry. It was about recognition, accountability, and the revelation of identity that no one in the restaurant had anticipated. The owner, ever meticulous, felt a ripple of unease. Something in the family's composure, their demeanor, and the subtle confidence they exuded hinted at a truth she could not yet grasp. Staff exchanged glances, unsure whether to speak, act, or wait. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, caught in the suspense of a moment that promised upheaval. And then, as the family approached the host station, a subtle but unmistakable realization dawned on the owner. Something about the father's posture, the mother's composed gaze, the quiet assurance of the children. It was familiar, significant, impossible to ignore. She had encountered this family before, in contexts far removed from her restaurant, charitable initiatives, influential social circles, and philanthropic endeavors that shaped the city quietly but profoundly. Her heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The family she had dismissed as ordinary, unworthy, or irrelevant was anything but. They were pillars of influence, recognized by insiders yet underestimated by those blinded by surface appearances. The host's error, the staff's assumptions, the denial of entry. It all began to feel like a misstep that could not go unnoticed. Not when the truth of the family's identity came to light. The air thickened with anticipation. Patrons glanced curiously at the growing tension near the entrance. Some whispered. Others tried to appear unconcerned, unaware that a revelation was unfolding that would disrupt their perceptions and leave the restaurant reeling. And then the owner, her pulse quickening, stepped forward with measured authority, preparing to confront the reality she had ignored the night before. She could see now that this was no ordinary family, no casual dining mishap. It was a moment that demanded recognition, humility, and a reckoning with assumptions that had gone unchecked for far too long. Yet before she could speak, a subtle gesture from the father, a quiet, deliberate movement of his hand, hinted that the evening would unfold in ways far more shocking than anyone anticipated. The staff froze. The patrons leaned in, and the owner realized with sudden clarity that the family's presence was about to expose truths that would challenge every assumption she had held about respect, status, and the consequences of prejudice. The restaurant owner now understood the family's identity, but the father's subtle gesture hinted at a revelation far larger than she could imagine. What the family revealed next would leave everyone, including the staff and patrons, stunned. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted, imperceptibly at first, then with the weight of inevitability. Patrons continued their meals, but whispers threaded through the air like an electric current. Something had changed. The subtle energy radiating from the family commanded attention. Yet it was not ostentation, it was quiet authority, the kind that radiates from experience, influence, and unwavering confidence. The father took a single step forward, his posture upright, composed, yet undeniably commanding. The mother's eyes scanned the room, not with fear or expectation, but with calm determination, a serene acknowledgement that the nights earlier, injustice had prepared this moment. The children, who had observed their parents' poise, mirrored the same quiet assurance. The owner, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation, felt a ripple of unease. Something in her chest tightened, a mixture of guilt, disbelief, and growing apprehension. She had prided herself on knowing the city's influential circles, on understanding the faces that mattered, the names that carried weight. Yet now, standing before her, was a family she had dismissed, whose presence alone demanded recognition, whose identity she was only beginning to grasp. As the father extended his hand toward the host, an acknowledgement, a gentle correction of the prior misstep, the subtle gesture, carried an invisible force. It was as if the act of reaching out conveyed authority without a word. The host, frozen in uncertainty, glanced at the owner, his own embarrassment reflecting in his eyes. He understood, at last, that he had made a grave error. The mother, meanwhile, maintained eye contact with the owner. Her gaze was not accusatory. It was composed, deliberate, and commanding respect. The owner realized almost viscerally that this was a family accustomed to influence and recognition, accustomed to navigating a world that often underestimated them. And yet they had chosen restraint, patience, and a quiet demonstration of dignity rather than confrontation. Then came the revelation, an unspoken truth that did not require shouting or dramatic gestures. It lay in the details, subtle hints of connections, the quiet confidence of the father, the understated elegance of the mother's movements, the children's composed presence, philanthropic events, city council initiatives, social impact programs, charitable foundations, names, faces, contributions, all pointed unmistakably to a single truth. This family was powerful, influential, and deeply respected in circles the restaurant often claimed to cater to but had failed to truly recognize. Gasps rippled quietly through the staff as the realization sank in. Patrons, sensing tension but unsure of its origin, leaned in subtly, straining to understand the silent drama unfolding before them. The air itself seemed charged with suspense. The family, calm and poised, did not need to speak. Their presence, their composure, and the invisible weight of their identity spoke louder than words ever could. The owner, now fully aware of the gravity of her establishment's oversight, felt a swirl of emotions, shock, embarrassment, and an urgent desire to rectify the mistake. She stepped forward, hands slightly trembling, and acknowledged the family with the respect they had long deserved. Her voice, when it came, was measured, sincere, and unhurried, yet carried the weight of accountability. The father's subtle nod in response signaled a quiet acceptance, but it also carried an unspoken expectation. This was not just about apologies, it was about recognition, about understanding the consequences of assumptions, prejudice, and dismissiveness. The mother's serene gaze reinforced the point. Respect was earned not merely through wealth or status, but through acknowledgement of dignity, identity, and presence. Yet the story was far from over. The father, a figure often underestimated because of appearances, allowed the moment of recognition to linger before making the next move. A discreet wave toward the staff revealed a hidden truth, a document, a card, or an invitation that suddenly reframed the entire evening. Patrons and employees alike glimpsed it, and the subtle gasp that escaped the lips of a few staff members spoke volumes. The revelation was simple, yet earth-shattering in its implications. The family previously assumed to be ordinary, unremarkable, or even insignificant, carried influence that extended far beyond the restaurant's polished doors. They were connected to the very networks, foundations, and organizations that shaped the city, making the restaurant's earlier dismissal a glaring oversight with far-reaching consequences. The tension in the room transformed into awe, curiosity, and silent recognition. Even those who had dismissed the family initially could no longer ignore the truth. The quiet elegance of authority had triumphed over assumptions and prejudice, and the entire dynamic of the restaurant had shifted in ways that would be remembered for years. And then, as the owner began to process the enormity of the oversight, the father made a subtle motion toward a back office, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for ordinary movement. Yet those who were perceptive noticed the shift. The implication was unmistakable. There was more to reveal, something that extended beyond mere recognition or apology. The family's true reach, their capacity to influence, and the consequences of the restaurant's initial misjudgment were only beginning to unfold. Every staff member, every patron, every observer felt the suspense thicken. The realization hit like a quiet explosion. The evening was not simply about seating a family or correcting an error. It was about unveiling truths, reshaping perceptions, and challenging assumptions that had long been taken for granted. The restaurant, once a bastion of polite exclusivity, now felt like a stage where lessons about dignity, recognition, and the hidden power of quiet authority were being demonstrated. And as the father's subtle gesture hinted at the next revelation, everyone present sensed that the story was far from complete. The night's events promised consequences, surprises, and perhaps even transformations that would leave no one untouched. The father's gesture pointed toward a hidden truth, something that would shock the owner, staff, and patrons beyond recognition. What the family revealed next would not just be about respect, it would challenge the very hierarchy of the restaurant and expose secrets no one expected. The restaurant's air was thick with anticipation. Staff and patrons alike leaned subtly toward the front, drawn into a silent drama that had transformed an ordinary evening into an extraordinary revelation. Every gaze followed the family's movements, every whispered exchange of glances adding to the tension. The father, calm yet deliberate, led the way toward a discreet back office, his family close behind. The mother's eyes reflected quiet confidence, and the children mirrored their parents' poised demeanor, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding its scope. The owner's pulse quickened. She followed, partly out of curiosity, partly out of apprehension. Pride and guilt tangled in her chest. She had assumed authority, believed she understood the social hierarchies of her patrons, and yet she had dismissed a family whose influence she had only now begun to grasp. Every step closer to the office amplified the weight of her oversight. The father paused just outside a nondescript door, subtly signaling for the owner to wait. With the faintest motion, he handed over a folder, thick, official, unmistakable in its weight. The owner hesitated, her fingers brushing the envelope. It bore an official seal, recognizable to anyone familiar with the city's elite institutions, but unfamiliar enough to provoke a pang of uncertainty. The subtle authority emanating from the father made it clear this was not a casual gesture. Inside the folder were documents detailing the family's true standing in the city, their philanthropic work, board memberships, high-level connections to governmental and social organizations. Every page illustrated influence, accomplishment, and respect that had long gone unnoticed by the casual observer. Names of initiatives they had founded, grants they had awarded, and programs they had launched painted a picture of quiet power. This was a family who had shaped the city without needing recognition, whose contributions had gone largely unheralded to the public eye, yet whose impact was indisputable. The owner felt her breath catch. Her mind raced, connecting the dots she had ignored for so long. The staff had hesitated, uncertain, because they sensed authority, but they did not know the magnitude. Patrons murmured, sensing the shift in energy, their curiosity mixing with surprise and a touch of awe. The subtle, deliberate power the family radiated was palpable, transforming the restaurant from a stage of polite dining into a theater of revelation. Then the father did something unexpected. He extended the folder to the owner fully, not as a threat, but as an invitation, to understand, to acknowledge, and to correct the error. It was a gesture both commanding and forgiving, designed to teach without humiliation, to assert influence without aggression. The owner accepted it cautiously, flipping through the pages, each revelation more astonishing than the last. Whispers rippled through the restaurant. Patrons turned in their seats, unable to resist the magnetic pull of unfolding truth. Staff exchanged wide-eyed glances. The reality of the situation crashed over them like a tidal wave. They had dismissed a family of immense significance, a family whose identity, once fully understood, made the previous night's denial seem petty and almost reckless. And then came the next layer of revelation, the twist that transformed astonishment into awe. Hidden within the documents was evidence of a project the family had recently initiated, one that directly impacted the restaurant's sector. Grants, partnerships, and plans were underway that could elevate or devastate businesses depending on recognition, cooperation, and respect. The family's influence was not abstract, it was immediate, tangible, and directly linked to the establishment before them. The owner's hands trembled, slightly as she absorbed the magnitude of the oversight. The staff shifted nervously, the weight of their assumptions suddenly clear. Patrons, though unsure of the specifics, sensed the drama, the reversal of power, and the unfolding lesson about perception and prejudice. The air pulsed with anticipation, charged by the unspoken question, what would the family do next? But the father was not done. With deliberate calm, he gestured to the room, drawing attention to the subtle shifts the family had orchestrated. The children stepped forward, holding a small framed certificate, public recognition of the family's recent accomplishments. The mother revealed invitations to a major philanthropic gala, open to influential leaders across the city, subtly including the restaurant in a network of opportunities it had overlooked. The combination of humility, authority, and influence left everyone in the room stunned. The restaurant, once a symbol of exclusivity and control, had become a stage for a lesson far more profound. Respect cannot be assumed. Influence cannot be measured by appearances, and underestimation carries consequences that can be immediate and profound. The patrons' chatter shifted from casual dining conversations to whispered awe. Staff stood frozen, unsure whether to speak, act, or retreat into the background. The owner, heart pounding, realized that her response in the next moments would define the restaurant's reputation, her credibility, and her ability to navigate the consequences of what had just been revealed. Yet even in the midst of this revelation, a subtle sense of suspense lingered. The father's demeanor suggested that this display was not the final act. Something further, something transformative and irreversible, was yet to be revealed. It was a gesture, a pause, a moment that promised the climax of the evening. The room felt poised on the edge of a precipice, suspended between astonishment and anticipation, as if the next move would not merely correct an oversight, but redefine the very dynamics of recognition, respect, and authority within the restaurant and beyond. The father's final gesture hinted at a transformative action, something that would leave the owner, the staff, and the patrons completely stunned, and forever alter the restaurant's place in the city. The true magnitude of the family's influence had yet to be revealed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Patrons, staff, and even the owner herself felt a palpable shift in energy. The quiet authority of the family had transformed the atmosphere, turning a place of ordinary dining into a stage for revelation and reckoning. Every eye was drawn to the father, whose calm, measured demeanor suggested that what was about to happen would surpass all previous expectations. He stepped forward, folder in hand, and gestured subtly to the documents and invitations laid before the owner. But it was the next gesture that truly froze the room. From inside the folder, he produced a letter embossed with an official city seal, a declaration that the family's recent initiatives had earned them recognition at the highest municipal levels. Grants had been allocated, partnerships approved, and major social programs initiated, all in direct coordination with organizations that the restaurant, until now, had overlooked. The significance hit the owner like a shockwave. She had prided herself on knowing the city's influential figures, on understanding the networks that drove opportunity, yet the very people she had dismissed were not only influential, they were architects of programs that could uplift or impact entire communities, including businesses like hers. She opened her mouth, but words failed her. The staff shifted uneasily, some standing rigid with embarrassment, others whispering among themselves. Patrons, sensing the tension, leaned in slightly, watching the unfolding drama with fascination. The children stood quietly beside their parents, radiating calm assurance, as though fully aware that the unfolding scene was not just about recognition, but about the correction of assumptions. Then the father spoke, not in words but in action. He handed the owner a formal invitation, a private gala honoring civic contributions and philanthropic excellence, an event that included key leaders, decision-makers, and influencers throughout the city. The restaurant had been invited to participate, not as a bystander, but as a recognized contributor to the community's growth. The invitation symbolized a bridge between oversight and acknowledgement, opportunity and redemption, humility and recognition. The mother's eyes met the owner's, serene yet commanding. There was no anger, only expectation, a subtle lesson in respect, accountability and awareness. The owner felt the weight of the evening, the mistakes she had allowed to occur, the assumptions she had made, and the potential consequences of her oversight. But she also felt the path forward, illuminated by the family's deliberate demonstration of influence, patience, and quiet authority. The staff, meanwhile, had begun to absorb the full implications. The host, who had denied the family entry the previous night, lowered his head slightly in acknowledgement. Others nodded subtly, realizing that this moment was not just about correction, but about understanding a truth that went far beyond appearances. Dignity and influence often reside where assumptions fail to see them, and then came the final revelation. The twist that ensured the night would be remembered long after the last plate had been cleared. The father, with a calm motion, revealed a subtle connection to a network of patrons and city officials that directly influenced restaurant operations, licensing, and grants for community projects. The implication was clear. The restaurant's future, its reputation, and its standing in the city were now subtly tied to the recognition and respect it had afforded or failed to afford to this family. The owner, fully comprehending the magnitude, felt a surge of humility and urgency. The evening's lesson was undeniable. Assumptions based on appearances, prejudices, or arbitrary judgments could have consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. Respect, acknowledgement, and recognition were not just moral obligations. They were essential for understanding the dynamics of influence and opportunity in the real world. The family, their dignity intact, their influence fully demonstrated, prepared to leave. Yet the impression they left behind was indelible. Patrons whispered, staff lingered in awe, and the owner stood rooted in her place, reflecting on the lessons of the night. The refusal that had seemed small and isolated now appeared monumental in its implications, a reminder of the cost of underestimation and bias. As the family exited the restaurant, a sense of calm authority accompanied them, leaving the room transformed. The owner, now fully aware of her misjudgment, vowed silently to ensure that respect, acknowledgement, and humility would govern her establishment henceforth. The patrons and staff, still processing the revelation, understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet power of dignity, the unassailable strength of character, and the lessons that come when assumptions are challenged. Outside, the city continued its hum, oblivious to the quiet drama that had unfolded within the restaurant. But within those walls, the night had changed everything. The family's subtle, deliberate actions had turned an act of exclusion into a lesson in respect, influence, and humility. And the owner, once confident in her authority, now carried the weight of understanding that influence is not measured by appearances, and that the consequences of dismissal can ripple far beyond a single evening. The family walked away unnoticed by most, yet leaving an indelible mark, a quiet reminder that those who are underestimated, who are dismissed as ordinary, often possess the power to reshape the perceptions of entire communities, leaving everyone who witnessed them stunned and transformed. The family, refused entry one night, had revealed that influence, dignity, and quiet power are not dictated by appearances. In a single evening, they transformed assumptions into lessons and prejudice into acknowledgement. The restaurant would never be the same, and neither would anyone who witnessed the revelation, because true authority often resides where the world least expects it.